Did you all hear that?
Yeah, so what do I
Yeah.
hit? Got it?
So don't swear, don't use any curse words now.
Oh.
That's great because I may have to leave.
All right, so I'm gonna make some announcements, okay? So of course, the bad news is that we lost Barbara Soboloff on Sunday. And I did want to mention this, just to remember her.
Right.
And remember, she gave us a tour at the Holocaust Museum. But the good news, and she's not even on yet, is Elsa Silverman's son is getting married next week. So she's going to a wedding next week, which is nice. So we wish her well. Oh, this is the last meeting. And we're taking a break over the summer. Okay, but I want to say that the next meeting, thank you, Ellie. She has graciously offered, or gracious and generously offered her house, and we are hopefully going to meet. We're going to meet in person in September at Ellie's house at 10:30 on Monday, September 13th. Okay, Mondays at 10:30. And also bring $20. You bring your lunch, like we used to, bag it, and bring $20 for dues. Okay. And we're still looking for new members. Cookie sent me the name of somebody, and I wrote to her and I sent her the mission statement and everything that's been written out. Thank you, Sue Bowley. Where are you, Sue?
Yeah.
Yes, right. So I sent her a copy of what we're all about. I even invited her to join this because I thought she could get a sense of the group, but
Do I get emails just because I joined this?
say that again.
I'm wondering about becoming a member. Do I get your emails just because I signed up for this, or?
No, but are you interested in becoming a
Sure.
member?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you live in Washington?
Definitely.
Okay.
I can vouch for Judy when we have the meeting. I'll send your name in, Judy.
Yeah, good, do that. And you know what? I'm inviting the first three, we're gonna do it in stages, so we don't get a huge new class. And so the first three will come in September, and the next three will come in January.
Sandy, I have a terrific person for January,
Okay,
and I'll send you the information.
okay, good, okay. So anything else? Does anybody want to say anything before I mute you and shut you all up?
Sandy, I'm just wondering if other people are getting the message that said you have a meeting in progress and they can't get on, if there's a way to go find them. Because we had
Well,
like,
I sent the invite. I'll send it once more. This invite includes the link.
Right, which Sandy has been really great about
How
sending the
about,
link.
how about the waiting room? Do we have a waiting room?
I don't see a waiting room.
I don't require it.
Well, because I can tell you that when I came on, just before 4:15, it said the host will let you in.
Well, that's always true.
Right.
That's not called a waiting room. That's,
Well, I waited for a couple of minutes.
well, because it takes time to back and forth through Zoom.
Danny, Kate had that problem and it was the other meeting that you canceled. That's what I'm saying.
Well, I know that, but the one that I've corrected, I corrected it 2 days ago. I corrected it this morning, and here comes somebody else.
Okay.
And I corrected, and I've now sent 2 invites as we've been meeting.
Okay.
All right.
People will check.
All right. So everyone except Vivian and Kate. Thank you, by the way, Kate. Thank you so much for joining us. Would everybody else mute themselves? Or I'm muting you, and you two unmute yourself. Okay, so Kate has unmuted, and Vivian, you have to unmute yourself. And here comes Elsa. And you might also want to go to speaker mode now. I've been on gallery so far, but now go to speaker so you can see the PowerPoint. All right, it's all yours, Vivian.
Okay. Well, you never know when things are going to be of interest to someone. I have a good friend, Carol Rolnick, who moved to Annapolis many years ago and got involved with the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, which she called CERC. And she was going to a CERC meeting and a CERC program and a CERC committee meeting and a CERC speaker. And I said, okay, well, what is this? So she started telling me about it. And when Sandy said she needed another speaker for June, I said, wait, I have someone. So unfortunately, or fortunately, Carol is moving today into a new place. So she's not able to be on the phone, but she's a volunteer on the advisory board. But she introduced us to Kate Bauer, who's with us today with her beautiful background of her garden, which everybody here loves gardens. So I'm just going to take a minute to introduce Kate and thank her for being with us today and being on the call. Sandy and I were on a call with her already to kind of overview what we're going to be doing today. Kate has a background in corporate communications. She moved from there to association management with responsibilities for publishing, issues management, public relations, strategic planning, and governance. So maybe we could use someone with her skills, Sandy, on our committee. In 1991, she started a consulting career focusing on governance and strategic planning for not-for-profit organizations. When she retired in 2017, she started Flip the County Coalition to focus on local elections. And she just completed service on the Citizens Advisory Committee for Anne Arundel County, where she lives, and Johns Creek, which is off the West River, which I guess is somewhere near Annapolis, because I don't exactly know the logistics there. In any case, Kate has been the volunteer chair for the Director's Circle of this Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. And they've actually been working on a presentation to do in slideshow form because of COVID, but hopefully people can go there and sign up for their newsletter and their lectures and stuff in the future. But I'm going to turn this over to Kate to tell us what CERC is all about.
Thanks, Vivian. I'm going to first check my technology and make sure that I can share my screen. So bear with me for just a second. We don't need that. But it still wants to show up. Well, isn't this strange? Just be patient 1 minute. This is not my strength.
So what we're going to do is we're going to have Kate do the presentation and then open it up for questions. So keep your questions in mind as we go. We'll be able to ask them at the end.
Good. And having said the mouthful of the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, you now know why we call it CERC.
Right.
This is a photograph of the part of the property. It was originally 368 acres and $1.7 million bequest from Robert Lee Forrest to the Smithsonian in 1965. It is now the fourth largest landowner in Anne Arundel County with 2,650 acres.
Okay, but Kate, is that a slide or is that what's behind you?
No, I should have a slide up.
No.
Are you not seeing it?
Not seeing it yet.
All right, so let's figure out why that's the case.
Sandy, do you have to give her permission?
I already did a long time
Okay.
ago. Multiple participants can share simultaneously.
And you're not seeing the slide.
Right.
You should be seeing a photograph of CERC. Let's go back to,
But it's a beautiful backyard.
yeah, it is, but it should be sharing my screen. It's even, here we go.
Oh, good. Okay.
Okay.
Now, can you see it?
Yes, great. Thank you.
All right. So what you're seeing is part of the CERC campus. As I said, it's 2,650 acres, 16 miles of shoreline along the Chesapeake Bay and the Road West River watershed. It is the largest contiguous environmental research body on the Bay, which focuses on environmental research, education, and public access. To get from the 368 acres that were extant in 1965 to that 2,650, no public funds were expended, no federal funds were expended to acquire that land. It came as a result of bequests and as a result of fundraising to acquire the property. The budget is about 1/3 from the federal government and 2/3 from grants and contracts. And it ranges somewhere between $16 and $20 million a year in research projects. It focuses on the edge. You ask where it is, it's sort of halfway between Washington and Baltimore. It's 20 miles south, roughly. Well, this slide says 7 miles. It seems more like 20 when I drive it. So if you know anything about Anne Arundel County, it is due south of Annapolis. And in this slide, off in the distance, you can begin to see the Bay Bridge. So it gives you a sense of perspective. This is the research dock at CERC, which is on the road. And its focus, as I said, is on the edge where the land and water meet, where approximately 70% of the population of our country is expected to live within the next few years. I'm sure you probably know that the Chesapeake Bay is a drowned river valley that is the result of a meteor strike about 35 million years ago. What we have seen is increased sea level rise, and we're studying the impact of that along with other issues. I will use we, although I'm certainly not one of the scientists. As Vivian said, I'm a volunteer who's learned a lot of science in my last 4 or 5 years there. So one of the things that the CERC location provides is proximity and access. We have the bay to draw from, where we can look at ecosystems, we can look at the watershed, the adjacent landscape, and we look at what we call the 3 Ls, the land-sea combination, large-scale studies, and long-term studies. In fact, CERC has 2 of the longest running studies of their kind ongoing, and I will talk specifically about that. One of the things that's important to understand about CERC is that it does not lobby and it does not advocate for policy. It, however, helps influence policy as a result of the research that it does, and it provides the data that supports policymakers. Examples of that are setting crab harvests, what the appropriate level should be for crab population harvest, for the use of and control of ballast water, which we'll talk about before we're done, and mercury levels. In fact, CERC research contributed significantly to setting the standards in the Clean Air Act. So CERC tries to create an understanding of how the environment works and how, not how we stop climate change per se, but how we mitigate the problems that are occurring and help people understand how the current environment is being affected by human interaction. CERC was a happy accident. This is a photograph of, excuse me, Robert Lee Forrest, who was a bit of an eccentric bachelor dairy farmer who lived in Anne Arundel County from 1878 to 1962. He bequeathed his farm, 368 acres, called the Java Farm, and the Java Farm was named for the USS Java, which was a British ship in the War of 1812 that was captured by an early owner of the plantation, what was known as Java Plantation. The legend is that the farm was purchased with the owner's share of the bounty for having taken the Java, and hence the name continued from Java Plantation to Java Farm. At any rate, when Robert Lee Forrest died, his lawyer walked into S. Dillon Ripley's office in 1965 and said, guess what? This gentleman is giving you $1.7 million and 368 acres of land. What do you want to do with it? And there was quite a
You're muting, Kate, you're muted.
We've lost Kate.
Yeah, okay.
all right. So where did you lose me?
You said about the giving the money and why. Now you're getting into that.
Okay, that's weird. There was a discussion about whether to sell the property and add it to the corpus of the Smithsonian or whether they should keep it. And after a number of people went out and looked at what was basically an abandoned farm at that point, the decision was to use it as a field station for long-term environmental research. And that became prescient. This is what the farm looked like in 1935 as a functioning, healthy dairy farm. And this is what it looked like in 1965 when the Smithsonian took over. It had been vandalized for 20 years. And yet the very first labs for research were located in these cow barns. It went from this kind of a setting where the labs were in cow barns to graduating to FEMA trailers. And ultimately in 2016 to the Matthias Lab, which I'll show you in a minute, which is a $60 million LEED platinum building. So this gives you a sense of the acreage and how it lays out. This is the Road River watershed. And the green is the most intense part of the circuit property. You'll see it butts up to private holdings. But it is the self-contained nature of this property, the contiguous nature that allows us to do long-term studies. And those studies look at 4 primary areas: fisheries, climate change, coastal water quality, and air quality. And we'll look at each of those. But first, I want to give you a sense of the kind of outcomes that CERC's research has produced. It has been responsible for the reduction of mercury pollution in the food chain and in seafood. It has created science-informed fishery recovery and management in a way that no one else has. It has resulted in valuation and measures of carbon sequestration of coastal ecosystems, land management strategies to reduce nutrient pollution into the water, effective strategies for coastal shoreline stabilization, conservation of declining coastal fish stocks, invasive species management, both on land and in the water, operational knowledge for crucial ecosystems for the forests, wetlands, estuaries, and mangroves, and that information being integrated across landscapes to help organizations like the Chesapeake Bay Program set policy and set programs in place. So this is in about 56 years that this has happened. The focus of the research is in 5 major areas: global climate change, pollution by toxic chemicals, nutrient effects of agriculture, forestry, and urbanization, overfishing and food webs, and invasive species and loss of biodiversity. As I said before, the focus of CERC is not to prevent climate change, but to plan for its future impact and to try to mitigate it wherever possible. So climate change is probably the most largest focus. And the world's longest CO2 study has been going on at CERC since 1986. What you see in this photo are actually pods whereby you can control for heat, for the amount of oxygen or CO2, sorry, where you can set the parameters, the amount of moisture that might duplicate what the world would look like in the year 2100. And so since 1986, the field staff has been studying the impact of CO2. Now, we hear about CO2 a lot. We hear about climate change a lot, right? We're talking about drought and forest fires and expanded tropical storms. And we hear about the role that CO2 plays. But one of the things that we don't hear much about is the impact of CO2 on the food value of plants. And what shocked me was to learn that the crop yield, the nutritional value of the food we plant, declines by 10% for every degree of temperature in excess of 86 degrees Fahrenheit. So what that means, if we continue to have the mean temperature go up, the amount of food we have to produce to provide the same nutrient value to people will have to go up as well, which is significant when we have a climate that is facing significant food shortages. To put that in context, when this study started in 1987, CO2 was between 280 and 300 parts per million in the atmosphere. It is now 400 parts per million.
Wow.
And by the year 2100 is expected to be 700 parts per million. This study, let me see if I do it, if it'll go, this study was initiated by Bert Drake, who has since retired. As I said, looking at the wetlands of the future, and this is a picture of the marsh at Cirque, to look at the impact of CO2 on plant growth, and thus in terms of food supply. What we know is that the marsh that he is sitting on has grown between 6 and 7 meters based upon the organic matter that has been incorporated over the past 18,000 years. We do that, they've done that through core samples to know that data. And yet sea level rise now is outpacing ground rise. So we have a balancing act that's getting harder and harder to keep in context. So this gives you an overview of what is called GCREW, Global, I never can remember the way the acronym plays out. Global Research Environmental Wetlands Study. But this is part of the marsh, and each of these little white dots is another pod where the temperature, the humidity, the water is all, and the salinity is all being controlled and measured. This is not a site you can visit because it is an active research site, but it gives you a sense of the context of where it lays out on the property. And Pat McGonigal now is the primary principal investigator on this study. The second of the long-term studies that I wanted to reference is the work we have been doing in forest and ecology management. And the big tree plot, which you see here, that shows you where all of the trees are in a 38-acre piece of the property. And what's going on? Sorry, there's this buzzing going on. I can't figure out what it is. And my computer keeps jumping. Sorry, that was just making me a little nuts. This study's been going on since 1987. This big tree plot looks at 115 acres, 50,000 tags on trees of 78 species. And a tree gets tagged when it is the size of your thumb, when it's about a centimeter around. So this gives you a plot of the varying sizes of trees. So why is it important to track trees? Well, one of the things we've learned is that trees actually breathe. They are bigger in the morning and smaller as the day goes on, and they put more oxygen into the air. And we know that by this dendrometer. You can see Jess Parker, who started this project. We measure a tree and put a dendrometer that has a band that is the width of a human hair that can be checked by the hour, by the day, by the month, or by the year. And what we have found is that trees are growing 2 to 4 times faster in the last 30 years than they did in the prior 250 years. We think that's a result of the increased CO2. So Forest Geo is an international look at the same kind of data, and CERC is the temperate plot coordinator for our data feeding into 67 plots in 25 countries, measuring 5.5 million trees, covering 8,500 species, to understand how climate change and the atmosphere is affecting the growth of trees and what they contribute. These trees are checked and rebanded every 5 years. So we go back into the forest plot, and if new trees have come up, they get measured, they get tagged, they get measured. The existing trees get measured. And of the total plot, there are 38 acres that get that every 5-year study. And that's a volunteer effort where we have people go into the forest. It takes about 6 to 8 weeks in the summer. We did it last time in 2019, and literally go through 38 acres and tag every growth that is bigger than your thumb and record it so that we can do the kind of plotting that you saw a moment ago. So we're also doing a 100-year tree experiment. Now, if you look at this field, it doesn't look like very much. It's some things growing and some things not growing so well, surrounded by forest. But what it really is an overview of a study that will track how diversity in terms of growth patterns impact the long-term survivability of trees. So biodiversity is intended to decide the impact of climate change, the impact of drought, the impact of pests, both above and below ground in terms of carbon sequestration, what it does to water quality and retention, and what it does in the way of habitat for insects, birds, and mammals. So 16 native species have been divided into plots. There are plots with a monoculture, 32 plots with only a single species, 19 plots that have a mixture of 4 species, and 12 plots that are a polyculture of 12 different species, or 19 plots that are 12 species culture. The intention of these 20,000 trees over 50 acres is to consider how and which plants thrive better. Do they grow better in a single species plot? So here you can see, and I can't tell you which is which, but here you can see a group that looks like it's thriving, where here is a group that doesn't look like it's done quite well at all. And this is 8 years of data. So we've got a long way to go to get to a 100-year study. But it's a fascinating look at how all of the relationships play out. I'm not touching anything. What's going on? Ugh. My phone rings and my computer shifts. That doesn't make sense. Anyway, another place that we look at is the idea of toxic chemical pollution in power plants. As I mentioned, the work in mercury research by one of the CERC PIs has led directly to the Clean Air Act. And she is now exploring naturally occurring mercury, that is not that's come from man-made pollution, but what normally occurs in the environment. We have a study at the Neon Tower, which is the National Ecological Observatory Network, which is funded by the National Science Foundation with a grant from Battelle to look at emissions as it comes down the tower. The tower is about 240 feet, and at about every 10 feet, it measures what's in the air in terms of nutrients, in terms of ozone, in terms of water vapor, in terms of CO2, in terms of and microbes. So from 240 down to the soil level. And it ties to 84 field sites, and it's a 4-decade-long study. Again, looking at how the air-water mix changes. We're looking at runoff and nutrient pollution. Now, I'm sure you've heard the term Chesapeake Bay watershed, but it actually goes all the way up into New York State. And so here you can see where the state lines are, but you see that the watershed goes beyond that. And this photo on the right is a runoff plume following a storm where you see the sediment in the water that starts up in New York and ends down in the Chesapeake Bay.
Wow.
So when you think about storm runoff and how it impacts, it's not just your street or your creek or your river. How long a tail this has is pretty astonishing. We look at stream discharge, and this is a weir on the property that has been measuring runoff for nutrient data and sediment charges for over 40 years. They examined the normal volume versus the volume after a rainfall, the water quality, the temperature, and how it shifts by season. What you can see in this photo is upstream to the right of either one of these pictures of the same person in a different month was a beaver dam. And 2 beavers moved in the 90s and literally dammed off the stream. And what that did was threaten 20 years of research because it changed the water flow. So unfortunately, Fred and Myrtle got relocated somewhere to another nice pond. But what we discovered by looking at what they'd done is essentially the beaver dam is the model for stormwater management. You slow it down, you spread it out, and you let it soak in. So that, slow down, spread out, soak in is the model that's used to change the way water flows if you're trying to mitigate stormwater. So this is a restoration of a stream bed that had eroded over the years to almost a 10-foot sink. It came at the end of a culvert across a busy road. And the water coming out of the culvert in heavy streams was like water coming out of a hose. Very intense and doing lots of destruction as it hit the soil on the other side of the road. So they went in, bulldozed, widened the area, added sand and wood chips to spread out to slow it down and spread it out. And this is what it looks like today. They added weirs, they added small dams like the use of the fallen trees, they added rocks, they put in a wider bed. And this experiment proved more effective than they'd possibly anticipated. The nutrient load that went into this stream at the headwater of the restoration period was reduced by 40%, which is huge. So 40% of the junk that went in never made it to the bay. It ended up in the land where it could be sequestered and slowed down and prevented from polluting the bay. Another outcome of CERC's research are riparian buffers, which you will see along highways, along farm fields. If you drive over on the Eastern Shore, most fields now that are adjacent to water have either shrub or tree buffers between them and the waterway. What they discovered was putting this barrier of trees between the open field and the water reduced the runoff and mitigated the nutrient flow into the water. It's also why you now see on highways lots of trees and plantings as opposed to pure grass. It makes a huge difference in slowing down the impact. Fisheries and coastal food webs are a big part of what CERC studies as well. And this is a picture of a blue crab with a tag. A number of blue crabs are put out at the beginning of each season that are tagged this way with a $100 reward to whoever finds it and calls in the number. Some 90% of the crabs that are tagged are identified within the first month of being dropped. Part of what we are trying to do and part of what CERC research resulted in is a better understanding of crab migration and spawning. Fertile females who have been inseminated go down the bay in the fall to spawn on the coastal shelf at the bottom of the bay. The males come up the bay and go into the mud. The juveniles stay in the tidal ponds. But what was happening in the late 90s and early 2000s when you couldn't find crabs for love or money was 90% of the female population was being harvested. So no fertile females, no baby crabs, no population. The result of CERC's research stopped those crabbing practices.
Carol?
They also track cownose rays, Atlantic stingrays, flounder, striped bass, and 5 species of shark that live in the Chesapeake Bay. And one of the studies they look at that I find most fascinating is a DNA study. They have identified the DNA of 75% of the fish stock in the bay, which represents about 300 species, and half of the invertebrates in the bay, which represents about 1,000 species. And because they now have that data on file, they can do an analysis of the stomach contents of almost any creature they catch and tell you what it's been eating it and where it's been eating. So it tells you how the food webs work together and what the implications are for future resources. There's the data from CERC study has changed patterns of how we recommend shoreline protection. On the left, you see a natural shoreline with fallen trees and sand beaches, which gets eroded. The trees get eroded by the shore action and ultimately fall in the water. On the right, you see an example of a living shoreline at low tide, where there is a barrier of rocks, not the riprap you'd see along somebody's, well, in place of somebody's hardened bulkhead, but followed by an open space and grasses. At high tide, this is all underwater up to the grass, which means there are ways for sea creatures and mammals to get onto the land and off, and it provides a much more supportive habitat. The studies of water quality tell us that what's happening in the bay in particular is that we're seeing an increase in acidification of the water. The shoreline changes are happening. The oxygen content is declining as a result of increased phosphorus runoff. Sunlight and silt are having a greater detrimental effect on subaquatic vegetation, which is called SAVs. And that decreases the habitat for aquatic animals. And ballast water is bringing invasive species in. Here's a perspective. 100 years ago, there were enough oysters in the bay to filter it entirely every day. And 1 billion oysters were harvested annually in the early 20th century.
Wow.
1% of the oyster population exists today versus 100 years ago. Now, one oyster can clean 50 gallons of water a day. So the Road River, which is one estuary off of the Chesapeake, would need 60 million oysters to clean it. Nobody knows what's there, but it's certainly not 60 million oysters. But the decline is staggering, and it's the reason that the water in the bay is so murky. All right, one more. So not only do we talk about the water quality, we look at invasive species. And one of the really successful programs that's resulted from CERC research is the National Ballast Water Clearinghouse, which began in 1999. So as I understand shipping, which is not a lot, about 100,000 ships per year come into US ports. The majority of goods in the world are shipped by water, not by rail, not by air, but by water. When a ship leaves port, it fills its ballast tanks with water to give it support as it makes its journey across. And up until the early 2000s, that water that would be picked up, let's say somewhere in Japan, would be dumped in San Francisco Bay when the boat docked. The ballast tanks would be cleaned and new water would be taken on for the return voyage. But when it picks up the water in Japan, it also picks up microorganisms and other living creatures, crabs, fish, whatever, from the water. When it dumps it at its destination, it dumps all of those things into the water. So pre-2004, the estimates are that 200 invasive species were dumped into the Chesapeake Bay, and 300 invasive species were dumped into San Francisco Bay. As a result of this work, there is now requirements that ships change their ballast water 200 miles offshore. That brings in open ocean water, and the belief is that the critters that get dumped mid-ocean or 200 miles offshore are unlikely to survive an open ocean the way they would if they were in a port. There's also additional studies now being done about how to clean the ballast water using UV light to try to make sure that if there's something there, they have managed to mitigate it. So these are some examples of marine invasive species. Jellyfish, green crabs, zebra mussels. I'm sure you've heard the stories of the Great Lakes, which are now pristine in terms of being able to see in them. But the zebra mussels, which did that, have also clogged intake valves and intake pumps on water stations and created all kinds of chaos. And whether something's invasive or not depends on your perspective. Here, we all love our blue crabs. We're doing everything we can to make sure that it survives and thrives. But 5 or 6 years ago, blue crabs ended up being dumped into the Mediterranean. There are no natural predators for blue crabs in the Mediterranean. So they are now an invasive species in the Med, eating all the local stuff because nobody knows how to deal with them. They have no one to keep their population in check. So the ballast water studies are intended to reduce the likelihood of invasive aquatic species. And this just gives you a sense of traffic. This goes back to 2010, but it shows you the kind of Panama Canal ship traffic that you see in a 45-day period. We rely on sea transport for the majority of things we have. So we need to make sure we're not bringing stowaways when we bring the cargo that we're looking for. And it's not just marine invasives. The marsh is a big part of the bay ecosystem. And Phragmites is one of the biggest plant invasive species we face. Marshes are a major carbon sink. They will sequester something like 40% of the CO2 in the area where they exist. They protect our shorelines, they reduce flooding, they provide a habitat for 70 to 80% of the fisheries, and they protect water quality by helping to filter the water. Phragmites, which has been here for some time, originally from Australia, turns out to be a better carbon sink than the native grasses. And it does slow down shoreline erosion because its roots go really, really deep, 12 to 15 feet down into the marsh. But they also are really tight, so nothing can get through. The little fish that would have lived in Spartina in the marsh can't get through. It's hard for ducks and other marsh birds to nest in Phragmites and be able to introduce their young to the water. So that Phragmites is pushing out the Spartina, is pushing out the native sedges. It's almost impossible to kill. Roundup will do it, but nobody wants to put Roundup in the middle of the marsh. And it reduces native species breeding. Now, this is a boardwalk across the marsh on one of the hikes on Cirque property. And you see that the Phragmites, which is this feathery grass, and this, by the way, this boardwalk is 6 feet above the marsh. So it shows you how tall this is. When I first started going to Cirque about 5 years ago, it stopped about here, about the base of the picture. The scientists at Cirque suggest that within 30 years, this marsh will be gone and it will be all Phragmites. And there's really nothing they can do to stop it. So Cirque leads research networks. There's the Marine Geo Network, which is 30 sites globally, looking at the kinds of things we've been talking about. In their Marine Science Network, they are working with the National Museum of Natural History, with the Smithsonian Marine Systems. I can never remember all of these. The Caribbean Coral Reef Ecosystem Program, and STRI, which is the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, to look at these kinds of issues like mangroves, invasive and native biodiversity, food webs, land use, carbon processing, nutrient loads, a wide range of marine science issues. And we are in the midst of an expansion from where we were originally, looking at building a new visitor center, an environmental leadership conference, expanding the experimental research conference, and keeping the core conference, the core research campus intact. But we still have a few FEMA trailers tucked in the corner that we're living with. And this is Matthias Lab. It is Smithsonian's first LEED Platinum building. And LEED is leadership in engineering and environmental design. So to get this for a laboratory as opposed to an office building is quite an accomplishment. if you look at this building, you will see across the roof line and in the parking lot, solar panels, which provide about 16% of the energy needs for the laboratory. I don't know why this is so touchy. In this area down here, which is a meadow, there are also 250 geothermal wells that produce the balance of the necessary energy. All the plants on site are native. Sorry, I'm frustrated because I don't want to use my cursor and have it jump on me. This is a series of 4 rain gardens that treat and clean water from the property that comes off the rooftops. CERC has really begun, or has really walked the talk in terms of being environmental. The lab is designed so that it is due south to maximize the solar capacity. It's on the site of that former dairy barn that I showed you at the beginning of our conversation. And if you look at this right across here, you see what we call a series of eyebrows that are designed into the building so that on the winter solstice, the maximum amount of sunlight comes into the lab. And in the summer solstice in June, it is the minimum amount of sunlight to keep the building as cool or as warm as necessary, depending on the time of the year. This is not a public access building unless there is a lecture event being held in the atrium. Because it is a working lab, it does not allow visitors. This is the Reed Center, the site of education, where if you come to campus, you will sign in. It is the site of the only public bathrooms on campus at the moment, which is a really important piece of information to keep in mind. We have restarted walking tours on Wednesdays and Saturdays. So you have to pre-register. It's about a mile walk that takes you along the waterfront and along the marsh, part of the marsh and part of the forest to get a sample of what's there. And this is where you come together. I apologize, I don't know what's going on with this today. CERC does a lot of professional training. In addition to its staff, there are interns, graduate students, postdocs, and visiting scientists. And part of that expansion that I was talking about is to build new facilities to house more postdocs so that folks can come and work on their own research or collaborate on the CERC research. We have about 15,000 visitors, between 15 and 20,000, except last year when we had none. And there are a number of programs that are put into place. This is an example of a canoe tour that we offer. In 2019, we had a music festival at the Mansion Ruins. We will be, I assume, reinstating a program called Science Saturday, which is a quarterly Saturday morning with a CERC scientist designed for kids 12 and under. And it's a fabulous way to bring your grandchildren or your kids, if you have kids of that age, to come and see a specific aspect of the kind of environmental science that's being practiced. We do a triathlon every September, and we have a lecture series, which is the third Tuesday of the month from January through October. And Vivian Carroll is chairing the lecture committee. That's why she's so involved. And thankfully with Zoom, we've been able to keep it going through the pandemic. Our biggest lecture of the year is October 19th. We do a capstone Robert Lee Forrest lecture. And this year, Catherine Hayhoe, who was a climate scientist, of some significant renown will be with us to talk about what's going on in that arena. She is also the founder of Science Moms, which is a program for women who are trying to do science research and raise families at the same time. And she'll be talking a bit about that. You can find out more about the entire lecture series at the SERC website, which is si.circ.edu, I think. I mean, circ.si.edu. I have it bookmarked, so I never have to look at it. So we have citizen science. We have 19 projects at any given time, some 5,500 volunteers, and you can do everything from architectural dig. Here, they are looking at what grows on a polymer plate that gets put in the water and submerged for a while and see what kind of critters adhere. You can come and count mud crabs and see how many of the mud crabs have been turned into zombie crabs by a parasite that's come into the water, that once it invades these mud crabs, completely takes over their system and controls everything about them. SERC is also a convener of collaborative organizations to bring awareness to issues affecting the Chesapeake Bay. Ultimately, we talk about SERC as science in your backyard. We are leading research for environmental stewardship and watershed management, public connection to science through educational programs and engagement, access to shoreline and nature. A lot of the kids that come out for the educational programs have never even seen the bay, let alone walked on its shores, thrown a seine net, seen a crab in the water, or fished. So it really is a terrific program. It becomes a model for sustainable landscape and facilities. If you come or when you come to hike, and we have 3 trails that are available and open for hiking, you will see that deadfall stays where it is. The trails are managed only to the extent that they're cleared so that you can walk them, but the forest is not changed. It's allowed to be as natural as possible. And we look at land conservation, open space, shoreline protection, and ultimately it increases the property value for everybody who lives nearby, which is fabulous. So I would hope that you would come and join us. We are open Monday through Saturday from 8:30 to 4:30. The website is here. As I said, there are 3 trails. And those trails range from about a mile to about 2.5 miles. None of them are really tough hikes. They're a nice walk in the woods, particularly lovely on a day like today when there's no humidity. We have wild orchids on site. There are lots of little benches and places you can stop and look at what's around. The one downside is you may not bring your pets. Because it is a working research center, no outside animals, unless it's a service dog, are allowed. So I would invite you to come and explore this great research resource that's in your backyard, not quite as close to you as it is to me, but let me get rid of my screen and I will try to answer any questions you have. And if I can't answer them, I will get you the answer through inquiry with the folks who know.
Great. Hey, I can't see you on my screen. I lost you. There you are. Thank you so much for doing this presentation. I certainly learned a ton that I didn't know about. And I'm sure other people have questions. I'll let them go first. I have a couple that I've jotted down. Does anybody have a question? I'm like, yeah. Andrew Boots? You're muted. Sandy, you got to turn off the muting. Let everybody unmute.
Well, they have to unmute themselves.
You have to unmute yourself.
Well, Amy is unmuted. How about Amy?
So
Okay,
I
why don't you
was
start and then
curious.
Sandy and Pat.
Oh, here we go.
Amy?
Okay, so I was curious on the tree, on the increased carbon dioxide and the trees growing faster.
Mhm.
So so by the trees growing faster, do they reach do they die? Does it shorten their life cycle? Do they have roots that go down deeper? Is it just an acceleration of what was normally a natural rhythm of tree living and dying? Or
My understanding, Amy, is it's an accelerated maturation. We don't know yet whether they die faster, because many of these species are multi-year, right? Oaks around here are 100 to 150 years old. So one of the things that CERC lets us see, because there's very little old growth forest there. It was a dairy farm. So it was all open pasture until 1965. So most of the forest is less than 60 or 70 years old. So we don't yet know whether it dies off faster, but we can, by looking at a tree, we can see that it's getting bigger faster than it would have 50 or 100 years ago based on old data.
is that because it has more, it's like, its nutrient is carbon dioxide, so it's got.
That's the belief.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Sandy and then Pat.
Thank you so much. This was very interesting. A lot of it I needed more time to absorb. So I'm definitely going to the visitor center. I go to Annapolis every week, so
Great.
that should be easy. And just to locate it, it's off of Route 50, off Route 2.
It's actually off Muddy Creek Road, 468, which parallels Route 2 to the east.
Okay.
So if you come down Route 2, go left on Central Avenue, which
Okay,
is
well,
214.
I'll find it. I just didn't know wanted to know whether to go east or west off of 50 on Route 2.
Off of 50, you go south.
Okay, so, okay. I'm curious about how many people, first of all, I think it must be a place where if you work there, you've died and gone to environmentalist heaven.
Yeah,
Really, it's
absolutely.
incredible. How many people are employed? We heard about volunteers, but how many people are employed as
About-
scientists and
About
engineers?
180 in various capacities. There's about 25 to 30 principal investigators at any given time, and then the supporting staff. And that's primarily at the CERC. There is a CERC West in San Francisco that does parallel work. And then there's the connections to the other SI research.
Okay, thank you. That's my questions.
Pat?
Two questions. One of the things that I recall clearly is that the chicken farmers who lived near the waterfront near Chesapeake Bay were responsible for a lot of uncontrolled manure, I guess, going into the bay. You didn't mention in terms of mitigation, has the research center had any effect on that practice?
No, not, remember, they do not do policy.
I understand.
They have looked at and helped study farming practices, but there's been an awful lot of data, Pat, about the runoff issues from chicken farming and the nitrogen counts from manure. But CERC has not been directly involved in that, at least not to my knowledge.
Second question, I just recently toured the Beltsville Agricultural Center, which is near me, and amazed at the size and scope of that place that looks as if it has at least 14 different research centers. It looks as if some of the things they're doing there have parallels with what's going on at CERC. Is there a relationship between the two?
There are relationships between some of the PIs. I don't know that there's a formal relationship between CERC and Beltsville per se, but the folks are doing, if they're doing parallel research, they're probably doing it in concert. It's a pretty integrated network, even though folks may be doing their own research studies, because remember, most of their funding comes from contracts and grants. So you come to me and say, I want you to do, or I come to you and say, I want to do this study on this. Will you fund it? And here's what's in it for you. And they will look for other sources, but they're not necessarily doing joint studies. I'll be
Okay.
happy to see if I can find out more details for you on that if you'd like.
I was just
That's
gonna say.
okay. I'll
PI
check on
is-
this end.
Yeah,
Thank you.
PI is primary investigator. So every research project has one primary investigator who writes the grant and other people collaborate. And from my experience at Georgetown, I know in medical research, grantors were really looking for collaborative research. That was a big plus in your grant request if you were working with other people, other agents, other institutions or agencies.
Thank you.
Kate, it's Lily down in Louisiana. The issues that you spoke about, we have them 14-fold down here. We have oil wells that are spewing oil. Our oyster production is down. Our coastline is evaporating daily. It's just amazing to me that your little area, and I say little, your area is focused so well on what's going on there. But the problem is the Gulf of Mexico,
Absolutely.
the Mississippi River that comes down, you know, everything ends here. So it was very informative to see what you do.
Well,
And,
go ahead.
you know, how much more should be done down here, but ecology and environmentalism really are two words that are not in our vocabulary because we have oil and gas industry.
Right, at least for a while longer.
Yes.
But one of the things that the hope for CERC research is that it's taken and applied in other places.
Mhm,
For
mhm.
instance, in the Gulf, you have a huge oyster
Yeah.
industry, right?
Yes.
When the water gets more acidified, oysters can't make shells.
Mhm.
Crabs can't make shells because they
Yeah.
can't get the calcium from the water.
Mm.
So, or sufficient calcium from the water. So
Mhm.
you know, it's what comes first. And if you are
Mhm.
dependent upon the income, it's not as big as oil and gas, but from the seafood industry,
Mhm.
the threat of the water being hot, sour, and breathless, right? The temperature is going
Yes.
up, it's
It won't get worse.
gets acidified, and there's no oxygen. Your oysters can't pick up and move down the river the way the fish can.
Mhm, mhm.
So all of it fits together, and hopefully, you know, the kind of research CERC is doing can be used by folks in your part of the world to make the case for the kinds of changes that are necessary.
Mm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anybody else with a question?
This is just a comment, but isn't it, maybe this was said and I wasn't listening, but isn't that why not much has been done about the chicken coop? Because there's a huge industry in Maryland.
Yeah, and more in Delaware than Maryland.
Is that right?
And we have it in Mississippi. Mississippi and Alabama are huge chicken processors.
Yeah.
So it's coming from all over. Well, the eastern side of Louisiana, the US.
Yeah.
Sandy, I just want to say thank you again to Kate. For someone who's a non-scientist, you've certainly gotten a lot of
Yeah.
scientific information. You would have fooled
Yeah.
us. So thank you again.
I hope you come to see it. I know it's not right in your backyard, but we are open for, you can come for a tour, which you have to pre-registered for, but you can also come and just take a walk. You can come and walk the trails.
Sounds
And it is a glorious place to just be out in the woods and
Mhm.
along the water.
wonderful.
Yeah,
Right.
Oh, yeah. Susie,
Kate-
question. I'll ask my
yeah, I have a question. You said you can come and you can take the walk and on the trails. Is there information along those trails or that you can pick
Yes.
up that will tell you what you're looking at?
Yes, if you go
Yeah.
to the Reed Center where the picture I showed you where the bathrooms are,
Yeah,
and the guard will send you there because that's where the parking lot is.
yeah.
There are maps that guide you through each of the 3 trails
Nice.
and tell you about it. And we are now in the process one of our projects is developing QR codes to put at various places so that it's like going to a museum. We're not there yet, but that you can use your cell phone and get a little history of the area. And we're also working on a history walking tour because there is several significant houses on the property or remains of houses on the property that go back to the early 1700s.
Thank you.
Judy?
Yeah, Kate, can you go there without registering? Just to
Absolutely.
go for the walks?
Yeah, you only have to register if you want to take the guided tour. And that's only on Wednesday and Saturday. At the moment, you need to wear a mask outside, but we got information today from the secretary that that's likely to change by the end of the month, that you will be able to be outside without a mask.
Right.
So
Sandy, you want to wrap it up or?
No, I'll just say, we're not that provincial. We've been to Easton and the museum there, right? We've been to, I don't know, the Underground Railroad. So we do venture out from time to time.
good. We don't bite out here in South County.
Well, Vivian, thank you for arranging this. This is really, and takes us out of our usual, the mall, takes us past the mall. Let's put it
Good.
that way. And Kate, thank you so much for this.
It was fun. My pleasure. I'm glad
It was most.
I'm glad you found it worthwhile, and I'd love to have you come visit.
Thank you. Well, guys, I'm gonna end the meeting, and I hope I'll see you all in September. Right? So bye, Carol.
Have a good summer, everyone.
Thanks for inviting me.
You're welcome.
Thanks for coming.
Coming.
What a great group you are. I wish we were closer.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.